This is Food for Thought with Deborah Walker. You're listening to Natural Health Radio. I'm Deborah Walker and this is Food for Thought. Today I'm on with Jerome Burne, who's the editor of Health Insight UK. He's an award-winning journalist who's been specialising in medicine and health for the last 10 years and now works mainly with the Daily Mail. His writing is absolutely brilliant, I have to say, on his blog called Body of Evidence, one of my favourite blogs, and I'm really pleased that he's joined me today on Food for Thought. Hello, Jerome.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that intro. Excellent.
Now, what was the aim in setting up Health Insight UK when there are so many other health websites available on the net?
Right. Well, the central idea was that there are, of course, different sorts of health websites. There are some which are more devoted to giving you information about diets or exercise routines, that sort of thing. This one was a bit more up the campaigning end. And I knew of a number of people who had ideas which are rather at odds with the mainstream advice on things like diet and high fat or low fat, and particularly in the area of statins and in drug use and so on. But what tended to be the case was that there would be individuals who would be campaigning kind of as a lone voice. They'd have their site, they'd have their followers, but it was all a bit kind of solitary. And it seemed to me that what there was room for was a kind of something that was a bit more collegiate. And so the idea was to encourage a number of people who were working in the same sort of area to come together to write for the site, to support each other, to exchange information and so on. And of course, we've now been running for nearly a year. I think our anniversary, first birthday is coming up sometime this month. And we've had about 90,000 hits, I think, and probably run something like 40 or 50 articles. So and we've got about 12 or 15 contributors, some of whom have done, more than others. But I think it has established itself as a voice, as a place. One of the ideas that I wanted to do was to kind of combine some of the campaigning that people had on their sites with a bit more journalistic polish, perhaps. I mean, I've been journalist forever, and I've been writing in the health area. In fact, I've been doing it for about 20 years, not 10 years. And I've written for a wide range of papers, and I write quite a bit now for the Daily Mail. And one of the things that you learn is just how to get quite complicated ideas over it in a sort of explanatory way. And what I've noticed happens is that often people who know an awful lot kind of forget that a lot of the audience will be rather limping along behind them, and there'll be very simple things which just aren't explained. And so one of my sort of things that I'm keen on is to make sure that the pieces are all pretty informed and good information, but also are accessible to people who both know a certain amount and who are starting from the beginning.
And what topics are you currently focusing on within the website so my audience know why they should head over to read it? Right.
My original idea was I didn't have any sort of particular things I wanted to do, but what's turned up is that statins, I think, is probably number one in terms of the number of articles we've done, and also in the kind of response that we get to it. The blog is very audience sensitive. I mean, I can put out something which maybe gets 300 or 400 hits, and then I'll put out something that the best ones so far have been statin ones, which may go as high as 5,000 over 2 or 3 days or so. So statins, because I think they're very important. They are the drugs which are given to more people than any other at the moment. I think there are serious questions over their benefits, and I think the way that that's emerged as to how they are promoted and the way the evidence is used is revealing about some of the techniques of not just the drug companies, but of also the way that the drug companies and the medical profession work together.
Now let's just dive into an article that you've written called "Statin Wars: The Empire Strikes Back," where you say if you aren't confused about what's going on with statins, you haven't been paying attention. Now, laughing aside, for those not aware of what's going on, can you give the listener an outline of the war that's actually raging around statins?
Well, for a long time, there are a few sort of old war horses, but particularly a wonderful doctor called Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, who is somewhere up near Blackpool, Liverpool, sort of north west of England, and he's been campaigning for a long time on the lines that I think everybody agrees that statins are useful drugs for people who've already had a heart attack, and the evidence does seem pretty solid that if you get put on statins, it'll reduce your chances of having another one. So that's kind of on one side, and it's probably worth just mentioning here that I'm in no way anti-drugs. I think drugs are a jolly useful things used appropriately, but in the case of statins, I think it's an example where the value of statins for treating people with perhaps very high cholesterol, although one can debate about that, but certainly people who've had a heart attack, jolly good idea, useful treatment, probably saves lives, and so on. The problem comes when with this sort of creep to expand use, and at the moment, up until about 3 or 4 months ago, the number of people getting statins, not because they'd had a heart attack, but because they were deemed to be at risk, was running at about something like 6 or 7 million. And then the thing which prompted the Statin Wars was a proposal by NICE, the organization which assesses whether a drug is good value or a treatment is good value, decided to double the number of people who were eligible for statins by dropping the level at which your risk. There are various calculations where you can say work out what the risk that someone has of developing heart disease over the next 10 years is, and it's based on things like your weight, how much exercise you take, your cholesterol levels, and so on. And these are all fed into a kind of mini questionnaire, computery thing, and out pops the answer that your level is 12, 15, so on. And it had been if you were above 20% risk, that meant that you would be eligible for a statin. And then at a stroke, NICE reduced it to 7%. So a huge number of people were suddenly pulled into the net. And that was the point where a letter was written to NICE, setting out a number of the reasons why this was really not a good idea, and why the evidence to show that people would benefit was the number of people who had to be treated for one person to benefit was extremely large. We're talking about anywhere between a couple of hundred to up towards the thousands. So if you think of that in terms of betting on a horse, we're talking about the chances of you actually avoiding a heart attack or death as a result. Death probably not at all, but even another heart attack, about 200, 300, 400 people would have to take the drug in order for just one person to get benefit. And then, of course, you have to factor in the side effects that the drug has, and both the issue of how much benefit you might expect and the issue of what side effects might be are ones that are highly disputed, and that's really been the area around the Statin Wars. And so about a little while before the NICE proposal, there had been a couple of articles in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, which raised, first of all, two of them. One of them raised serious questions about how accurate the data that had been reported showing that there was benefit for people healthy people getting statins. And the other article was one saying that the low-fat diet had been a serious mistake, and that there was this relates into the issue of cholesterol and how important cholesterol is as a factor for heart disease. And a very senior researcher called Sir Rory Collins, who was one of the people who had run very big and complicated trials, meta-analyses, where you get maybe 10, 20 large-scale trials, and you do complicated statistical analysis and then come out with a conclusion showing that actually, yes, if you look across all the data, there is benefit. I certainly get lost in that, and I think most people and most doctors do, and there are only a few people who can really follow it in proper detail. But one of these was a doctor at Harvard who does have a grip on all of this, and his piece in the BMJ concluded that the way that the evidence was presented really wasn't convincing for the benefits of what's called primary prevention, healthy people who haven't had a heart attack. And also the question of how great the side effects were, and the studies which were used to support the benefits of primary prevention by the unit that Professor Sir Rory Collins runs, which is one called CTT, which is a clinical cholesterol trialists, and I'll talk about them in a second. But they are a body which holds a lot of cholesterol data in Oxford, and Professor Collins and his team have been examining this data from the drug companies for years and producing studies which show that taking statins is worthwhile. So the Harvard John Abramson, produced his study in the BMJ, which raised questions about the value of a couple of the studies that Sir Rory Collins had been doing, and the other piece also raised questions about the benefit of keeping your fat very low in your diet, because this would keep your cholesterol level down. And there were questions being raised in another article about whether this was actually a good way to go about it, and whether a high-fat diet might well be even better protective. I don't want to go into that. That's a whole other kind of area of discussion, which we have covered as well. So there were these two sides kind of squaring off, as it were. And Professor Collins, being an extremely eminent man, demanded that the BMJ retract these papers, because he pointed out that there was an error in both of them. They both referred to a particular study which gave an estimate of the number of the rate of side effects. And the two papers both got wrong, for kind of slightly technical reasons, the percentage of side effects which might appear. The figure that was in the original article they quoted was something like 18%, and they put it in at about 20%. So we're talking about a very small percentage point. It was an error for kind of technical reasons. They apologized for that, but this wasn't enough for Professor Collins, who insisted that the articles be entirely retracted, which is a very dramatic step, and it's something that you only do if there's been evidence of fraud or serious, total misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the data. And this was the kind of thing that would normally be dealt with a small retraction. Somebody would write in pointing it out, and this would be appended to the article. And it's a standard thing that goes on all the time, disagreeing about particular points of data. But Sir Rory wanted the articles off and out, and so the BMJ set up a committee to decide this matter, and they got about 5 or 6 eminent and independent people who weren't specifically involved with the BMJ, and they heard evidence from Professor Collins and other people, and it was a sort of proper, careful hearing of the issue. And in the end, they concluded that it wasn't necessary to retract the papers, that the pointing out the error had been done quickly and efficiently. But there were a couple of very interesting points that came out of it, which raise further questions about the validity of statins. One of them was the fact that the data on which Professor Collins and his team at the CTT were relying was data which had only been came from the trials which were run by the drug companies. So it was drug company trials, and way back in the early 1990s, a deal had been done between this organization, CTT, and the major statin manufacturers to the effect that they would be able to hold this data, which would allow them to do their big analyses, and but that as part of the deal, they wouldn't be allowed to show their data to anybody else. Now, this has become a very hot topic because it's now pretty clear that drug companies are not very reliable in the way they report their trials. There are all sorts of ways in which trials can be arranged in order to get more favorable results, and the lengths to which the drug companies will go, and this has all been very carefully documented in lots of studies, and particularly in a book called Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre, who set out lots of examples of the way that this has happened. And so you have a situation where the major body providing the data that says you should all be taking more statins is relying entirely for this conclusion on data which is only comes from the big commercial trials, and more importantly, is not able to be seen by anybody else. There's a number of examples where this has caused serious confusion and error, which is in the case of Tamiflu, where the drug companies the company who makes Tamiflu, the one that was going to is given to people who have flu and is claimed to reduce it, it was shown that there were lots of trials which were never published and which were never part of the evidence, which the drug company had kept hidden. And we just don't know what's been happening with the statin trials. And we don't know if there are lots of glitches in the way that the statistics are done or things that are fudged and so on, because no one else can get to look at this data. So that was one thing that came out very clearly, and the committee said that really this data should be made available for other researchers so there could be another look at it. The other thing which came out was the fact that the CTT had always claimed that its funding only came from independent sources such as the British Heart Foundation or a government-run organisation called the Medical Research Council. And so the suggestion was, of course, that it was free of any kind of commercial influence. However, what came out as a result of the BMJ hearing and the committee was that Professor Collins released to the BMJ an account of his interests, or the interests, the declaration of interests of funding that the CTT had received. And when you went through that, it's available on the web. It's part of the papers that the BMJ put up on the web. You can see that the CTT received over £200 million in funding over the last 20 years from a single company, from company Merck. Now, there's a debate about how that money was used, and of course there's lots of questions about what influence it had, but what the outcome of the Statin Wars, and this was what the data the information I've just given you was what the letter that was sent out to NICE to object to the expansion of statin prescribing. The data was contained in there, and so you've got this picture that it's not simply that there's a lot of totally independent academics producing data showing that statins are safe and work really well, but you have a body which has very strong links involving large sums of money doing this research, which nobody else can look at. Now, we can't say that there's anything wrong or illegal or fraudulent going on, but if you are thinking of taking statins, it's certainly something you might want to take into account.
How are clients and patients meant to trust what's being told to them now if the levels of eligibility are dropping, so effectively it's allowing more and more of them in? If this is constantly moving sands, where is the trust if none of the data is transparent, funding isn't transparent? How do we know that actually people are taking what they're meant to be taking and it isn't just commercial gains?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, you don't know, and what the effect of this sort of statin wars is that this information about the reliability of the data and the issue of what the side effect rate is. I didn't actually clearly explain the side effect issue because that's another sort of that was the issue that Professor Collins went to war, as it were, on the papers that appeared in the BMJ because his claim was that the side effect rate was very, very low. And in some of his statements and publications, he said it was as low as 1 in 10,000 people had serious muscle problems. And a lot of other people would point out that, well, there's a particular serious type of muscle problem you can get with statins, which involves the actual destruction of muscle. There's another sort, which is where you get muscle weakness and pain and cramps and so on, which, among other things, can stop you exercising, which, of course, if you've got a risk of heart disease, is not a good idea. And then there's all sorts of people who claim to have brain fog and to have fatigue and a number of other sort of rather links with cataracts and so on. It's a murky area. What Sir Rory has done is to rely on data which has only been published by the drug companies. And it's, again, a complicated area, but essentially quite a lot of the studies of statins don't even record side effects, and there's a whole issue about what counts as a side effect and how it's defined and so on. A number of them don't record them at all, and the ones that do have a very wide range of the rate of side effects that show up, which is puzzling, and nobody quite understands it. But the short version of it is that we really don't have clear and good data on side effects. Sir Rory Collins was claiming that it might be as low as 1%. Even the manufacturers of Lipitor, which is the best-selling statin, put the rate at 10%. And there are studies which are observational studies, which are ones where you look at what happens to what patients report, which come up with figures of 20 or higher, and so on. So very grey area about, and of course, if you don't know what the rate of side effects are, you can't really make a calculation of, well, I've got a 1 in 200, 1 in 500 chance of avoiding having a heart attack or stroke, but I've also got a risk of developing muscle pains. Diabetes is one of them, and other unpleasant side effects. And trying to work out that equation is almost impossible because the data that we've got isn't that reliable. So what we're supposed to be given as far as statins is evidence-based medicine, which is what we always hear a lot of, and that's proper medicine, and a lot of the complementary and non-drug medicine just doesn't have the evidence for it. But statins is an example of, after 20 years, still some of the major questions, how well does it work and what damage might it do to me, haven't been clearly answered.
Where are people meant to go for quality information then, so they can take responsibility for their own health and their knowledge to move themselves forward?
I'm afraid that there isn't a site that you could go to, places like the British Heart Foundation, and if you were really keen, you could try and work your way through some of the extremely dense articles which are available on the web, or you could talk to. I mean, the degree of confusion over this is clearly encapsulated in the fact that that Pulse, the GP's magazine, at the time when NICE was planning to expand the use of the drug, sent out a questionnaire to its, I think it's something like, is it 35,000 GPs, I think. Anyway, they polled all of them, and what came back was that 50% of those who replied, I don't know what the percentage was of the total, but 50% of those who replied said that they would not use the new much lower level, the 7% sort of cut-off level, in terms of assessing whether they got statins or not for themselves or for their family. Because they didn't really believe the data, they didn't think it was worth it, and then there were practical considerations that they were worried that they'd be swamped with yet more patients coming in and all of the time that would take. But so they're confused about it, and what I would say, of course, is that a quite good account of the details is to be found on the HealthInsightUK site, and other related ones, like one run by one of our contributors, Zoe Harcombe, who is particularly specialises in food and diet, and Malcolm Kendrick, who has devoted probably 10 or 15 years of his life to poking around in statin statistics, and has come up with figures along the lines that if you were to take a statin for 20 years, it might give you another 2 months of extra of life, and so on. So there's a lot of how you express this data. But in the end, it's almost like a political decision. You know, do you think privatization is a good idea or not? I mean, one lot will tell you that it's a brilliant way of getting better service, cheaper service, more reliable, and the other lot say it's simply a device for putting large sums of money into the pockets of big companies for a poorer service. And both sides will produce statistics to show it. And unfortunately, rather than being a kind of glossy, shining, this is the truth based on science and evidence and research, it does look more like a kind of political decision. I mean, personally, I've been looking at it been following the debate for about 10 years now, and I'm convinced that it's not worth it unless you've got other problems. And at the very bottom line would be that there are lots of other things that you could do to protect your heart, which is probably going to be more effective, and certainly doesn't come with the risks that which we don't know quite how high, but the risks which definitely come with taking statins.
An incredibly informative and insightful interview with you, Jerome, today. Thank you so much for coming on Food for Thought. I really appreciate it.
Great. All right. Well, thank you.
I just have to say I can no longer read anything by Professor Rory Collins, because now I just think of him as the statinator. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.